Adrenal hormones. There are four main ones we need to think about, or classifications: aldosterone, androgen, cortisol, and epinephrine. We will specifically discuss the adrenal cortex hormones, different than the adrenal medulla hormones. The adrenal cortex hormones involve the hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal cortex axis. So in the hypothalamus, where are we considered, or what's the most important? It's the paraventricular nucleus. This paraventricular nucleus is what is going to release CRH that will then be released to the anterior pituitary to stimulate corticotropes. These corticotropes will then release another hormone, which is called ACTH. How is this process regulated? The hypothalamus releases the hormone, CRH, stimulating the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. ACTH has some negative feedback capabilities on its own. It can feed back to the paraventricular nucleus and decrease CRNH release. The adrenal cortex hormones, such as cortisol, will also have negative feedback components. That will feed back both to the anterior pituitary to decrease ACTH, as well as CRNH from the hypothalamus. So we have a multiple layered negative feedback system for adrenal cortex hormones. Also, we have a couple other stimulatory events. Stresses, such as physical stress, mental stress, and even some biological stresses such as low glucose can feed into this system and drive it forward, meaning that despite negative feedback control, you can override this process by these stresses stimulating the release of CRH, which will increase the release of ACTH, which will then increase cortisol. There are also a lot of effects of biological rhythms, and there are a number of biological rhythms that we need to concern ourselves with. There are those that last about a day, which are circadian rhythms. There are ones that are associated with longer cycles, such as in growth and development, even some cycles that last less than a day, called ultradian rhythms. But even if we think about a whole day response, a circadian rhythm, there are some times in which cortisol release is higher than others simply because of the time of day. This biological rhythm needs to be taken into account when you're measuring cortisol levels in the blood. You need to know at what point of the day you're in, and you need to know if you're associated with a growth spurt or not to know what a normal value looks like. Of the cortex hormones, aldosterone is controlled a little bit differently. Most all the other hormones are primarily controlled by ACTH. Aldosterone, though, has a couple of additional regulatory factors. It also is in partial control by ACTH, but aldosterone synthase is also important. So in this last step to form aldosterone, two other items are important. The first is Ang2 or angiotensin II, and that's stimulated through the renin-angiotensin system. So in response to something like low blood pressure or low blood volume sensed in the kidney, you'll have an upregulation and an increase in renin release. This will increase angiotensin II, which stimulates this enzyme, aldosterone synthase, to produce more aldosterone. Other item that becomes important is the level of potassium. If you have high levels of potassium, it will also stimulate aldosterone synthase to convert in more aldosterone. Low levels of potassium inhibit this enzyme. So you can see here we have a number of extra regulatory steps for aldosterone that we don't have for other cortex hormones, such as cortisol. So what does aldosterone do that affects both of these two additional regulatory factors? Well, aldosterone causes fluid retention, and therefore blood volume becomes important. Aldosterone also causes potassium secretion and excretion. Therefore, potassium becomes an important regulatory step in its overall synthesis pathway. The control of epinephrine is different than the other adrenal hormones. So the cortex hormones were primarily regulated by what? ACTH, and then aldosterone by aldosterone synthesis. Epinephrine is a medulla hormone, which means it's synthesized in a little different spot. It's primarily controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So let's go through the classic sympathetic nervous system, and I'll use a compare and contrast approach to show you where it's a little bit different with producing epinephrine versus a normal nervous system response. So in the sympathetic nervous system, you have a preganglionic nerve fiber, which will synapse within a sympathetic chain ganglia, releasing acetylcholine to bind to a nicotinic type 2 receptor. This part is the same. You'll have a similar neuron, postganglionic fiber, but now it will synapse in the adrenal medulla rather than a ganglia. And it will directly stimulate a chromaffin cell. The chromaffin cell has the same nicotinic type 2 receptor. Both of these acetylcholine responses are stimulatory. If we go back to our traditional sympathetic nerve, what happens? You then stimulate a postganglionic fiber that then travels, releasing another neurotransmitter, norepinephrine in this case, to bind to alpha and beta adrenergic receptors on a target tissue. The adrenal medulla is a little different. Chromaffin cells will produce hormones, primarily epinephrine, a little bit of norepinephrine, release it into the blood, and then it travels through the blood to target tissues. And the epinephrine, norepinephrine then can also bind to alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. So it utilizes just a little different route to get to some of the same places.